Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Center for Geopolitics, which is in partnership with the university's Brazilian Society. I'm Brendan Sims. I'm the director of the center. This is, in fact, the first event we are having, which is specifically dedicated to Brazil, which we should have done earlier, but we are now doing it. I can't think of a more appropriate day on which to have this event, given that we have the opening of the G20 summit in Rio. And I can't think of anybody better to ask to Peterhouse, to Cambridge, to the Center for Geopolitics, to speak on the subject of Brazil's foreign policy. His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Patriota, is, of course, the ambassador to the UK. He has an immensely long and distinguished career already. I'm not going to rehearse every single milestone, but you will know that he was foreign minister, in fact, deputy foreign minister. He was ambassador to the US, ambassador to Egypt. In fact, you've been pretty much on every continent, as far as I could make out. So I'm very grateful to you for coming to our humble college this evening and for coming to address us on the subject of Brazil's foreign policy, and we look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Sims. We got in touch through a common friend, João Vale de Almeida, who many of you will have heard of. He is a Portuguese diplomat who was formerly the ambassador of the European Union to the United Kingdom and was my colleague both in Washington and New York. So I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to address my first time in Cambridge, by the way. I've been several times to another important city with another big university, not far away.
Never heard of it.
But I'm very happy to be able to balance out my presence. And let me say how honored I am to see in the audience Ambassador Peter Wilson, who was British ambassador to Brazil, and Monica, his wife. Malik Dahlan, my good friend from Saudi Arabia. Vera Ines from the Brazilian Chamber of Commerce. Those are the ones I recognize offhand. Indeed, I think you're very correct in pointing out that this is a kind of good coincidence, happy coincidence, that I have this opportunity when Brazil is opening the G20 meeting in Rio de Janeiro, my hometown, where I was born. And not only that, but Prime Minister Keir Starmer is in Brazil for his first trip ever to Latin America, I understand, and to Brazil. There hasn't been a visit by a British Prime Minister to Brazil, I believe, in 11 or 12 years. The last one to come was David Cameron. So very different circumstances before Brexit, before the pandemic, before a number of important developments. So this is a great opportunity and a great occasion. I'll start speaking a little bit about the G20, since there is this kind of fortunate circumstance that coincides with this meeting here in Cambridge. And let me say that there are many things that G20 can do. Basically bring important countries around the table. The G20 today represents 85% of world GDP, 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's an excellent platform for exchange of views and attempts at building agreement or cooperation or possible consensus on predominantly economic, financial topics. But the G20 is not a replacement for an international system based on international law. It has no charter or covenant. It is not based on any international agreement. It's essentially a self-appointed group that meets and has acquired a certain credibility and I would say legitimacy given the fact that it is not a group of like-minded countries. It is actually a group where different perspectives on international challenges confront each other. And I think that's very important at a time when the multilateral system, based on the UN Charter, or the multilateral trading system for that matter, at the WTO and other instances, seem to be at a crossroads. Some people would say crisis. We witness significant paralysis in all of these mechanisms, the Security Council, the WTO, et cetera. So the role of the G20, I think, becomes more prominent in light of these circumstances. A former Chatham House CEO, Robin Niblett, who's published a book recently with which I don't agree with everything he writes, but I think there's something he says that is worth retaining, is that the G20 has become an important, what he calls, workaround. It's kind of a way of trying to address issues where the international environment is particularly challenging. Now, enter Brazil's presidency of the G20. I believe that the relatively simple, straightforward list of priorities that the Brazilian government established was actually a good approach in light of present circumstances. So you probably are aware of the three major points. Number one, combating hunger and poverty. Number two, promoting sustainability with a special emphasis on energy transition and financing for energy transition. And number three, improved global governance. Now, I believe that it so happens that in these three areas, Brazil has a substantive contribution to make, and one that carries a certain degree of authority, given our own experience domestically and internationally. As you know, President Lula, during his first 8-year term, established and attributed significant priority to reducing poverty and hunger, and he actually succeeded. And then subsequently, 2 subsequent administrations were not as successful, or perhaps were a bit negligent in this respect, so that what turned out to happen is that hunger increased, poverty increased, and we're now trying to reestablish the same level of success as was present 6 or 7 years ago. But internationally, the same phenomenon has been observed. I was just looking at President Lula's opening statement at the G20 in Rio, and the first point he makes practically is that the world is in a worse position today than it was when he last ruled Brazil. And hunger is more prevalent, inequality has increased significantly. You are familiar with some of the numbers. 9% of the world population suffers from some kind of malnutrition or lack of food. So I find it's very logical and important that a country that has placed so much importance on this topic should elevate it to one of its priorities. And it's very gratifying to observe that all the G20 members aligned themselves. There was one country that was resisting a little bit, and then we just got the news that this country joined. It's an important neighbor we have to the south of the border. And let me say, with respect to the United Kingdom, I was very pleased to be summoned to the office of Annalise Dodds at the Foreign Office when she handed me over in a rather solemn way, and there was a tweet afterwards with a very nice photograph, the United Kingdom support for the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. So by now, there are 81 countries that have joined. This project is not open only to G20 membership association, and 147 supporters. So the additional supporters are either international organizations or philanthropic institutions, Bill Gates Foundation, et cetera. I think this is already, we can consider this a major development and an important outcome from the summit. Secondly, on sustainability, energy transition, financing for what we sometimes call climate justice. I think you're all familiar with the topic, what is meant by climate justice. Many of the countries who have contributed the least to global warming are paying a high price, with very vulnerable economies, frequently very indebted countries. So there's a sense, I think, a growing recognition that these countries need some extra assistance. I was very pleased to witness firsthand the speech made by Foreign Secretary David Lammy at Kew Gardens about a month ago, where this recognition was very explicitly articulated. So I will come to the affinities between Brazil and the UK very shortly, but you will see that there's quite a solid foundation for a deeper and more all-encompassing understanding between the two countries. I won't go into the details of what is being sought through the sustainability energy transition pillar of the G20, but I would mention an innovative idea that Brazil brought to the table, which is actually applicable not only to energy, but also to hunger, to a number of areas where we today see a shortfall of financial resources, which is a notion that given the extreme wealth accumulated in the hands of a very small proportion of the world population, and that increased substantially, exponentially in some cases, from the pandemic to today, it would not be, let's say, unreasonable to look at ways of taxing these ultra high net worth individuals. So we ordered or requested a French economist, Mr. Zuckman, first name, Gustavo Zuckman, who worked with Thomas Piketty, you may be familiar with him, who studies on inequality, to establish, to provide us with some input with sound economic background. And it has also been gratifying to see how this idea has gained significant traction. I don't believe that it will be met with consensus at Rio, but there are already alternatives that are being explored. For example, there's a negotiation at the United Nations in New York on a taxation agreement. And one possibility would be to append a protocol to this agreement where countries would join on a voluntary basis. And the interesting thing and important thing is that several countries in the north, developed north, or G7 members, France for one, Spain, Germany, have supported the general concept and the general idea. And I see here in the UK, for example, how it is also, it has also met with serious consideration by the specialized media, The Economist, The Guardian, the Financial Times. I would particularly refer you to a journalist called Martin Sandbu. You may have heard of him, who has written extensively on the topic and who believes that the time has come for this kind of initiative to take place. Finally, on the third priority, which is global governance, we can also point to some relatively encouraging achievements. For the first time, the G20 met at foreign ministers level at United Nations headquarters in New York on the 25th of September. Now, this is important again to come back to my first point, illustrate the fact that the G20 cannot change the UN Charter. It cannot produce reform of the international financial institutions. It can, at best, suggest, orient, bring together ideas. And therefore, the meeting of foreign ministers at UN headquarters and the adoption of a call to action that includes quite specific objectives in the 3 or 4 areas, international financial, World Trade Organization, UN Charter, or United Nations per se, was not a trivial accomplishment. It has eluded previous G20 presidencies, and now I think the challenge is to translate this into effective change at the different international institutions. Not a simple task, but one that has now one that now benefits from some favorable wind. I would also point out that in his introductory statement at the same meeting where foreign ministers of the G20 met at the Trusteeship Council in United Nations in New York, President Lula suggested, and this is a purely Brazilian position up to this point, that we convene a review conference of the United Nations Charter under Article 109. Peter Wilson will know exactly what I'm talking about. And all those who have looked at the UN Charter realize that this is a provision that was never invoked in the organization's almost 80-year history. And the review conference, interestingly, can be convened by a 2/3 majority of the General Assembly and 9 votes in the Security Council. It is not subject to a veto. So we believe the time has come as a response to this erosion of trust in multilateralism, this erosion of respect for international law, international humanitarian law, and the need to go beyond just complaining about the current state of affairs and actually doing something about it. Let me mention in passing that I've been engaged in a few, I call them extracurricular initiatives. So one of them is Leaders for Peace. It's a group that was brought together by a former French Prime Minister, Jean-Pierre Raffarin, and has a British member, Mr. Peter Mandelson from the Labour Party, and 35 other members from around the world. And for the past 3 years, I've had the honor of assuming the kind of pen holdership of this group. I'm the rapporteur, so I elaborate a report, an annual report that is then discussed, amended to some degree. But I have to say that I've been very encouraged by the reception that I've received. The reports have by and large, the group has by and large endorsed the draft that I have submitted. And in the latest report, which you will find online, we developed this idea of the tipping points. So we're familiar with the notion of a climatic or environmental tipping point. Brazil, very acutely so, and as a consequence of the Amazon rainforest, which we host in its great majority. But I believe that there's a similar tipping point that we need to become more aware of, which is a systemic tipping point. There is no guarantee that the existing international order based on the UN Charter and other international instruments can survive a very prolonged period of violations and disrespect. We really need to act very quickly and with a sense of urgency and a certain sense of drama. So we even defend the idea in this report that although very significant numbers of manifestants, civil society members, youth groups, gender equality groups attend all these environmental COPs, as they're called, for biodiversity or climate, etc., we have yet to see a similar degree of awareness of the danger we are of reaching a systemic tipping point. And this is where I think also the reasoning behind the convening of a review conference of the Charter, it's within this kind of framework of an analysis of the current situation that Brazil has taken this initiative. I'll mention briefly as well another group in which I have participated for the past year or so. It has drafted a report which has become available at the T20 meeting in Rio called Toward a Better Security Order. The report was elaborated by the Quincy Institute in Washington under the coordination of an intellectual academic you may have heard of, Trita Parsi. He is of Iranian origin, an American citizen of Iranian origin. I think he also holds Swedish citizenship. He grew up in Sweden. And the idea behind this report, which is one that I would really recommend to all of you, because it takes as a starting point certain assumptions that are very much aligned with, let's say, the thinking of Brazilian diplomacy in today's world. One of them is that, there's this debate about whether we are evolving towards multipolarity, bipolarity, what kind of world will we be heading towards. So the terminology that is used in most of this report is post-unipolar. We don't know exactly what awaits us, but what we are certain of is that there is no return possible to unipolarity. And this is a very important realization in itself, because no matter how genuine the desire for specific countries to make themselves great again, which is perfectly understandable and legitimate, we want all our countries to be great, there is no way that you can go back to unipolarity again. So the kind of context that we are confronting is one where nations will need to adjust to a certain distribution of geopolitical power, which is without precedent. And this in itself is a challenge. But perhaps here, Brazil is relatively well placed to play a stabilizing role of some kind, a role of contributing for dialogue to be preserved, for an eventual multipolarity be one of cooperation rather than one of breakdown in communication or conflict, or even something that this report, I think, in a rather original manner, describes as a multi-order world, which could be very detrimental to international cooperation. In fact, it would be let's say, returning to a pre-Westphalian kind of world, where different orders apply in different parts of the planet. And this may not even be a fragmentation along geographic lines. It could be very transcontinental in itself and breed a very high level of unpredictability and confusion. So, having made these comments about the G20, and incidentally, I would also highlight the fact that nowadays the G20 has become really a very multifaceted show, because you have not only T20 bringing together think tanks, but you have the S20, the social G20 that met last week in Rio. It was a big success with representatives of civil society. You have a B20, which is business groups, private sector, and so on and so forth. So really an interesting opportunity for countries and representatives from different cultures, perspectives, geopolitical assessments and evaluations to express themselves in a diplomatic and civilized way, let's put it that way. Let me transition a little bit then to how Brazilian foreign policy expresses itself today in the world. I often use a word that I pick up from several of President Lula's speeches and manifestations, and I've noticed that he's been using this word more now in his third term than during his first two administrations. And this word is humanism. Humanism. It may seem a little bit curious for an audience in Cambridge, in the United Kingdom, to listen to a Brazilian diplomat trying to convince them that, Brazil has become a spokesman for humanism. But I hope that I managed to convince you that this is indeed the case today, because what Brazil represents in its foreign policy and also in its domestic policy, not success along all these lines, but a strong commitment to three very important civilizational causes. The first one is democracy. We suffered an assault on our democracy. Brazil demonstrated that its institutions were solid, strong enough for democracy to prevail, including through some mechanisms that we have that suddenly we realized, wait a minute, in some respects, we may be a more mature democracy than some very well-established democracies. One example is our federal electoral tribunal that judges whether partial results for electoral processes are legitimate or worthy of trust or not. So there's an interesting also application of this same commitment to international relations. So we're not only eager to preserve and improve and develop our democracy, and I would add here that one aspect of democracy that is very important in a very unequal country like Brazil is focusing on underprivileged segments of society. So for the first time in our history, we have a ministry that deals with the indigenous population, headed by a female indigenous personality, and Congresswoman Sonia Guajajara. We have 3 other ministries that deal with human rights issues, addressing them from this perspective of promoting greater equality. A ministry for racial equality, a ministry for gender equality, and an overall human rights ministry. So this is also without precedent, and I think signals a very strong commitment to a more inclusive democracy, one that does not only assure that the electorate's will is respected, but that also challenges society to change in ways that will render it less unfair and less unequal. How do you apply this internationally? When I was in Egypt, in my former post, I was invited to make a presentation to a debate on former UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali, who was Egyptian, as you know, and I discovered that he was the first UN Secretary General to defend the idea that countries that uphold democracy domestically should also project these values internationally. Now, it may seem strange for an Egyptian to adopt this position, not the most democratic or the best example of democracy in the world, but I think it can be explained by the fact that he represented a small Christian minority within a predominantly Muslim country. So the most important Christian minority in any Islamic country, as you're aware, 15 million people in a population of 100 million. So one of the characteristics of democracy is precisely to defend the rights of minorities. And when this no longer takes place, a yellow light at least, if not a red one, should appear on your dashboard because something is not going correctly. So building on this idea and this notion, I would bring the conversation down to 2 essential aspects of democracy that can be observed domestically and internationally. The first one is the idea that no one is above the law. So just as in a domestic order, very wealthy individuals, very powerful individuals politically have to be accountable to society through existing legislation. So the same should apply internationally. No country should be above the law. All countries should be accountable. And you should have a single standard for judging whether countries are behaving in accordance or not with international law, with international humanitarian law. I don't need to give examples, but the idea that if my ally commits a transgression, that's okay, but if my enemy does it, we're going to condemn him and multiply the instances where we criticize. This is not democratic. The second criteria is one of inclusive representation in decision-taking. So just as it would be undemocratic in a country like Brazil if the Northeast were not represented in our Congress or in our Senate, I think one could also reach the conclusion that it is not democratic for the Security Council to have no members from Africa or Latin America and its nucleus that has the greatest influence in shaping outcomes and decisions. And I believe that this is also, these 2 notions are ones that are gathering increasing support internationally, not only from governments, but also from groups like the ones that attend this lecture, academia, civil society, NGOs, even business partners to some degree who see merit in more democratic, more predictable, more legitimate. Sometimes I hear the argument that a larger Security Council would be unwieldy because, maybe more difficult to reach a decision. The example I often give is that when the G7 evolved into the G20. This was a kind of a transition in the same direction. I was ambassador to the United States in Washington when the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, Hank Paulson, came to a dinner at the Brazilian embassy and explained that, we're thinking of expanding the G7 because we've reached the conclusion that just meeting among the like-minded around the table doesn't really lead us very far because, this was the Lehman Brothers crisis time. What we need is to ensure that whatever conclusions we arrive at are implemented internationally. So we really need everybody around the table. And it was with significant US support that the G7 evolved into the G20. Nowadays, nobody defends the idea of going back to a smaller group. In fact, the G20 has been expanding, and each country that hosts the G20, as Brazil is doing, usually invites a significant group of other participants. So this is my first point about an important cause that Brazil embraces domestically and internationally. The second cause is sustainability. Sustainability understood in its three pillars: economic, social, environmental. Now, of course, the one that has acquired the greatest visibility nowadays in the media and maybe even intergovernmental discussions is the one of the environmental sustainability, and for a good reason, because there will be no salvation without cooperation. So it's really, even from an analytical point of view, interesting to note that this is the first time human society experiences a geopolitical transition in which there is a topic of vital importance to every nation in the world that simply demands international cooperation. Because no matter how virtuous a single government can be in applying or reducing its greenhouse gas emissions and with very ambitious targets, et cetera, this will not guarantee a future of sustainability on planet Earth. There's a point that Minister Marina Silva, our environment minister, makes very often about the Amazon. She says, well, we have committed to reducing deforestation to 0 by 2030. We've just presented at the Baku conference new, very ambitious NDC, along with the United Kingdom, by the way. So 2 countries that are leading the way, and this has been acknowledged by the UN Secretary General today. Very interesting coincidence as well. Antonio Guterres saying Brazil and the UK are showing the way forward on the NDCs. So it's an interesting trait, characteristic of modern times, of today's contemporary international relations, that this topic has such an importance. And here, Brazil has a kind of natural comparative advantage because it has the cleanest energy mix of any of the G20 members. In fact, a much higher percentage of renewables in our energy mix than the world average, something like 50%, whereas the world average is around 15%. This doesn't mean we don't need to make additional progress. By the way, I was going to make a reference to Marina Silva, and the comment that she makes is that even with 0 deforestation, the Amazon forest will still be under threat due to greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, elsewhere. So this is a collective, individual and collective responsibility, and we need to be very much aware of this to find ways of cooperating effectively. So second priority in the G20, but also a cause that the Lula government has embraced with, I think, a renewed sense of responsibility. I was ambassador in Egypt when Lula was elected for the third time, and through a unforeseen coincidence, the only country that he visited as president-elect was Egypt. So I had this pleasure and honor of hosting him at Sharm el-Sheikh during the COP27. And in participating in all the bilaterals that he held, John Kerry and European Union climate negotiator, Chinese, et cetera, the sentence that he would repeat in each instance would be, you can expect from Brazil the most responsible possible behavior on anything associated to the environment and to climate. I would even say that this may be one of the major evolutions in his thinking since leaving government in 2010. I think the years outside government, the years in prison, really convinced him of the importance of the topic and the importance of Brazil leading on this topic. There are several other aspects which I won't enter into for shortage of time, of financing for especially vulnerable countries, et cetera, that are at the table at the G20, in which we are playing a certain role by supporting innovative ideas, having some creative ideas ourselves. Finally, the third cause that I find deserves to be highlighted is the cause of peace. Now, this is an area where I would say there's a Brazilian specificity that is not always understood in its correct perspective. And as a diplomat, I've found myself often in a position where I have to explain, and let's say, I don't say this with any false pretense, but educate in the sense of making other audiences understand where we come from, what the rationale is for many of our positions. I was speaking to a group of students before I came here, Brazilian students, and we touched on this topic. A young man who is actually here now asked me, what kind of role does does diplomacy play in Brazilian history, and can we consider ourselves an important diplomatic player today? So I'll make a short digression here. I think to look at the degree of influence that a country has internationally, you could divide it up, to simplify matters a little bit, into military, economic, and diplomatic. So militarily, we're really in a world of, let's say, a trilateral kind of situation, with the West and NATO countries representing one camp, then China and Russia, the two other major players worldwide. Economically, you could argue that the European Union plays a very significant role as well, and to some degree, all the G20 members with large economies are playing an increasing role. And today, Brazil has the 8th or 9th biggest GDP, according to the IMF. So a relevant player, not a relevant player militarily, and with no aspiration to become a relevant player militarily. We're in a denuclearized zone. We have no enemies, diplomatic relations with every single UN member, no border conflicts since the 1870s. So that's more than 150 years. I would add that Brazil is a country that has been most often elected to the Security Council from the Global South, from the developing world. So also some degree of experience in debating peace and security issues. Now, how do you translate this specific situation into international action? Well, through diplomatic activity is my answer. And when it comes to diplomacy, differently from the military or the economic influence, countries of various sizes and different geographic locations, et cetera, can play very decisive roles. Let's look at Norway, for example, a relatively small country, population-wise, territorially, very developed. Through its Nobel Peace Prize, through its engagement in different discussions worldwide, including in my part of the world, in Colombia, for example, it has played a significant diplomatic role. So the way I would describe Brazil's position in the world today, I think when you first wrote me, you mentioned Brazil as a great power. I would avoid certain qualifications that are open to endless debate. You know, is it great or not great, or is it middle or not middle? I think what can be more easily ascertained is that Brazil has an important regional position as the largest country in Latin America, territorially, population-wise, economically, in terms of GDP. So you could describe Brazil as a regional power. But you could also describe Brazil as a regional power with global influence. Now, this was not always the case. I would argue that this has only really become effective in the 21st century, and through, for example, a very objective criteria, the opening of more than 35 embassies worldwide. So there is a annual study produced in Australia by the Lowy Institute, you may have heard of them, where they keep track of the number of embassies and consular offices that different countries have around the world. Interestingly, in 2023, China hit the #1 position for the first time, displacing the United States. But interestingly, also, Brazil is in the 10th position. So among the countries of the developing world, very visibly a country with a very global footprint, diplomatically speaking. Of course, embassies, they open channels of communication for trade, for investment, for all kinds, people-to-people exchanges, etc. So the way, having spoken of the three fundamental causes that Brazil embraces, democracy, sustainability, peace, and described Brazil as a regional power with a certain degree of global influence, especially on economic and some other issues of global concern, environmental, peace and security, human rights, where it is, to a great extent, leading by example due to its very rare involvement in any armed conflict. By the way, the one armed conflict in which Brazil was involved was World War II, as the only Latin American country that sent contingents to Italy to fight on the Allied side. This is important because, differently from a very large number of countries that I can think of, diplomacy and the pacific settlement of disputes can be considered a formative element in Brazil's national and international identity. I was mentioning to the Brazilian colleagues with whom I spoke something that I recently reread in a book by an Austrian writer, Stefan Zweig, who actually migrated to Brazil, but he first stopped through London. He was a friend of Sigmund Freud's, a very accomplished writer at the time. Ended up committing suicide in Brazil right after the Japanese invasion of Singapore, which was one of the lowest points in World War II. I think he lost completely faith in humanity and decided to end his life. But one of the points he makes in this book called Brazil, Land of the Future is a very interesting one that diplomats very often make, but I hadn't read a foreigner making it, is that we celebrate our diplomatic mentor, the Baron of Rio Branco. Most of you who have been to Brazil, who are familiar with Brazilian institutions, know that the diplomatic academy in the Brazilian foreign ministry is called the Rio Branco Academy. Why? This was a man who was foreign minister for 10 years and who solved, through arbitration, negotiation, diplomatic means, all our border issues. And we are the third country in the world with the largest number of land borders after China and Russia. So we have 10 land borders, not one single, zero border issues, thanks to this man. And the point Stefan Zweig makes is that, differently from other countries where he had been to, Rio Branco is much more celebrated than any military personality in Brazilian history. Every capital, every state capital has a Rio Branco Avenue. There are numerous statues around the country. It's an interesting indication of the profile of Brazil that this is the case. And I think it is also something that should not be taken lightly by those who demonstrate an interest in Brazil. By the way, I would recommend highly a book that I think has yet to be translated by a retired Brazilian ambassador, Rubens Recupero, called Diplomacy in the Construction of Brazil. And he elaborates this thesis in a very convincing way through examples that, in the case of Brazil, diplomacy is actually an element that is a constitutional element of our identity as a nation. So this is the way we have been approaching most of the challenges that we confront worldwide, not from any perspective of gaining additional influence in specific regions, but from the perspective of ensuring an international environment that is cooperative and based on respect for international law. I'm not sure how much success we will manage to achieve given the very challenging times we are entering internationally. But I am convinced that if a sufficient number of countries adopt a similar stance with their own particularities, I think we can build a bridge to a more predictable and more peaceful environment for nations to thrive in stability and through sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Your Excellency. I've got a couple of questions, and then I'm going to open it up for discussion and comments. I suppose the first question is to do with where you think Brazil is located in this new multi-order world, in the sense that, if we have a Western, broadly democratic world, we've got the PRC and Russia, which is, as you say, is part of the other world. Do you see Brazil as being yet another pole, a separate pole, or do you see it leaning to one side? Because if I look at the causes that Brazil is promoting, particularly now under the Lula administration, democracy, that would seem to differentiate you from Russia and the PRC. Sustainability, I suppose it's more mixed. Peace, I think most people would see there a clear line differentiating you from Russia, certainly. How do you see this? Do you see Brazil then simply as a completely different, separate pole, its own order, or is it somehow closer to the Western order?
Well, first of all, there may have been a misunderstanding in what I said. I don't think we are in a multi-order world as yet. I think a multi-order world is actually a threat to the kind of international system that we'd like to see, which is a universal single system based on respect for international law, respect by all for the same law. Multi-order is a challenge to that because it would constitute a world where some people follow certain rules and others other rules. By the way, there's an expression that gained currency during the Biden administration that is very troublesome: rules-based international order. I think the established expression should be rule of law, not rule of rules. Rules can be changed very easily. Rules of the game, for example. This is something that applies to bridge or to sports. But in international relations, what you need is laws, not rules. So this is where Brazil stands, first of all. Secondly, on democracy, yes, we're very committed to democracy, but we're also committed, as I tried to explain, to democracy being applied internationally. Now, there's a very curious paradox in this context. Brazil, of course, is invited to summits of democracy, such as Biden convened in Costa Rica about 2 years ago. President Lula ended up not attending, but he sent a videotape message. And there's one sentence in his message that I think maybe encapsulates his message. He says, "We will not support the idea of upholding democracy in order to erect walls or exclude voices internationally." So the application of the democratic principle internationally means don't erect walls, don't exclude voices. Maybe the regime of country X, Y, or Z is not the one that you prefer, but the voice needs to be heard. And this is how the United Nations have worked always. There have always been more autocratic regimes, less autocratic regimes, more perfect democracy, less perfect, or democracies in need for improvement. So where does Brazil stand? Brazil doesn't stand in any group that favors a hegemonic agenda for A, B, or C countries. I think where Brazil stands is in non-selective adherence to international law. If it's the United States and the United Kingdom, by the way, who invades Iraq in defiance of international law, we condemn. We're not in favor. If it's Russia who invades Ukraine, we equally condemn. And we voted twice in the General Assembly to condemn this. We consider this a very serious mistake. and in a very problematic attitude. But I think we also are in a comparatively coherent position to make the point that, wait a minute, some countries that are criticizing violations of international law have violated international law themselves. So how about rethinking our commitment to a system where everybody respects the same laws and there is no exceptionalism for anybody?
Thank you. So the other question I had was to do with Brazil's geopolitical situation, because as you quite rightly and really interestingly said, Brazil has no territorial disputes with its neighbor. It is, as you say, not aligned in the great global confrontation that is looming, in a sense we're already in. Having said that, one could see the danger of Brazil being caught somehow in the crossfire. So if you look, for example, at what's happening economically in South America, you've got an increasing presence of the People's Republic of China. You've got a new port, I think, in Peru, which from the point of view certainly of the United States is regarded as a threat. We now have a new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who has a particular interest in the Western Hemisphere, which perhaps wasn't true of previous incumbents. Mm-hmm. How concerned would you be about Brazil's ability to stay out of those kind of antagonisms?
To some degree, this is a concern that any country would have in the kind of transition that we are experiencing. Mm-hmm. If you read today's headlines and press here in the UK, there's quite a bit said about the fact that Prime Minister Starmer will be meeting with Xi Jinping in Brazil. So, to what degree will he be looking for a closer relationship? Or, it's a universal challenge, first of all. That's the first point I would make. Second point, I think we need to distinguish between what is acceptable, legal, non-confrontational in international relations, and what is illegal or transgression of very serious norms, for example, the peace and security domain. So it's not illegal for a country to seek economic cooperation with another part of the world, to build a seaport. Our trade with China has developed exponentially, and it's become our #1 trading partner since about 10 years. Mm-hmm. This was not something preordained or the consequence of a 10-year strategic plan. It happened to be a meeting of offer and demand, and a kind of complementarity that exhibited itself. Mm-hmm. We are a very competitive exporter of agricultural goods. Mm-hmm. China is heavily reliant on imports of agricultural goods. So this is something that has been going on. I don't think it's negative. It can continue. The United States is the #1 investor in Brazil. There's no reason why we should be uncomfortable with that. What would generate some discomfort is a kind of interference in our national affairs that is considered, let's say, incompatible with respect for sovereignty. So, for example, when a very important businessman who has now been chosen by the winner of the US elections to hold a significant position questions, the application of Brazilian law to his business in Brazil, I think this is unacceptable. But I haven't seen any significant businessman from the second largest economic power behaving in a similar manner.
Thank you. Okay, so now we open up for questions. It would be helpful if you could give your name and your affiliation, please, if you have one. Sometimes I will know it, but it'd be useful for the rest of the audience. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Lindsay. I'm a South African student comparing Brazil and South Africa's foreign policy, which may also inform my question. So my question was also looking at how does Brazil's central tenets of promoting democracy, sustainability, and peace going to map onto the Okay, I'll speak slower. I was saying I'm interested in looking at or asking you, how does Brazil's central tenets that we've discussed of promoting democracy, sustainability, and peace gonna map onto the expansion of BRICS? And what changes do you see possibly in the coming years of Brazil's leadership within BRICS and South-South cooperation?
Yeah, I think we need to go back a little bit in the, or to look at the origins of BRICS. It was an acronym created actually by a British economist who worked for Goldman Sachs.
That's right, Jim O'Neill.
Yeah, Jim O'Neill, yeah. Whom I met actually at the Labour conference in Liverpool last year. So what was the common denominator among these countries? The fact that they would have an increasingly important economic role internationally. And I still believe that this is the essential common denominator. So there are obvious areas for BRICS cooperation to move ahead that are non-controversial and that simply reflect existing inbuilt recognition of differences between North and South. So I'll give you an example. CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities when it comes to environmental discussions. With the exception of Russia, most BRICS are aligned on this. And there's, by the way, there's a smaller group called BASIC, which is Brazil, South Africa, India, China, that coordinates very closely on these affairs. On trade, for example, you have special and differential treatment for developing countries. So this is another, let's say, set of issues where there's an obvious convergence of interests. Reform of the international financial institutions. There's, again, a very similar agenda when it comes to claiming more opportunity for countries from the South to head the IMF or the World Bank and to hold proportions of the voting rights in these institutions that are more commensurate with their economic weight internationally. So I would say that just as the G7 coordinates between, among themselves before the spring and autumn meetings of the international financial institutions in Washington, there's scope for the BRICS to coordinate in order to advance these kinds of agendas. On other topics, there is no scope for very significant convergence. And I can give you a very simple example. Brazil, South Africa, India, the three multi-ethnic democracies of the South that participate in BRICS, they consider themselves, let's say, natural aspirants for permanent membership in a reformed, expanded Security Council. And what country today is the main obstacle to that expansion? I would say it's China. The United Kingdom supports it, France supports it. Now, President Biden, for example, went even to the extent of supporting 2 permanent members from Africa during the last General Assembly. The Russian position is sometimes a little bit unclear, but I don't see any major opposition. In fact, we've received signals from Russia that they would be very much in favor of India and Brazil joining the Security Council as permanent members. India, by the way, a country that has consistently abstained when the discussion on Ukraine comes up in the General Assembly. So maybe a better candidate for neutrality than Brazil in that sense. So I think this needs to be borne in mind. And the expansion of BRICS represents a certain challenge because of the number of countries knocking on the door. But you will have accompanied or read in the press, no doubt, that Brazil has expressed a certain reservation about a neighboring country in South America joining BRICS. So this is not, let's say, a group that would incorporate easily countries that are not sharing the same kind of minimal convergent agendas expressed in these terms, economic, financial, and trade to some degree. On the energy front, I think there's scope also for some productive discussion, especially if the United Arab Emirates have now joined, and there's a possibility that Saudi Arabia join. So This is the future of BRICS. Don't expect it to have joint positions on most political issues. On human rights, you can't even dream of common positions. All you have to look at as, the kind of commitment we have to gender equality or LGBT rights in Brazil, and this is completely anathema to many of the other members in BRICS.
Thank you. Gentleman in the second row.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm João Pedro Becking, an alumni of Curtin College here in Cambridge. Bit of a twofold question. What has a Labour's victory in the UK meant for Brazilian-UK relations, and what has the results of the American election could potentially mean for Brazilian-American international relations?
Well, the first question is easier to answer. The first question is simply, a much more favorable environment for an already very solid bilateral relationship. So I really make a point out of stressing that in previous, when previous administrations were in power here in the UK, the relationship was one of cooperation, respect, and friendship. One simple example of this was the fact that President Lula was the only Latin American head of state to come to King Charles' coronation last year. So irrespective of who was in government, the respect for the United Kingdom, friendship, interest in developing relations is there. Of course, if a Labour government is in power, well, look at what party is in power in Brazil, a Labour party as well, PT. Partido dos Trabalhadores. So the affinity, first of all, regarding labor rights is much greater than with a conservative agenda. But I must say that we are very encouraged by some of the initial manifestations of the Labour government. The first trip abroad by Energy Secretary and Net Zero Secretary Ed Miliband was to Brazil with a very successful and substantive agenda. In fact, one of the items on which there was agreement have just been translated into concrete results. UK and Brazil presented their more ambitious NDCs at Baku with recognition from UN Secretary General. On another front, and I think I stressed sufficiently during my initial presentation the importance we accord to international law. This is also very encouraging because Prime Minister Starmer, with his background in international law, has demonstrated through certain attitudes such as removing any obstacles from the International Criminal Court to deal with the Israel-Gaza situation, refunding the United Nations Relief Work Agency for Palestinian refugees, interrupting sales of certain weapons to Israel on the basis of evidence that points to violations of international humanitarian law, and the Chagos Archipelago situation. These may seem a bit symbolic here and there and less than revolutionary, but believe me, in speaking with the ambassador for Palestine in London, he was the first to say that these were very significant developments and very encouraging ones. So, and again, if we look at the three pillars, on democracy, there's no doubt the UK, democratic. In fact, in some respects, I must say that we look up to the United Kingdom. You've had a African descendant as foreign secretary. We are a country of almost half the population identifies as African descendant. We've never had an African descendant foreign secretary. Fortunately, today we have a deputy foreign secretary who's a female and identifies as African descendant. But we still have some way to go. On sustainability, I just gave the example at Miliband. And on peace and security, I think this commitment to international law is what really will make a difference in the future. So, in a certain way, I am answering your second question. To the extent that a new administration in the United States can qualify as democratic, committed to sustainability and to international law, I don't see any difficulty. If very significant departures from these objectives take place, I don't think this will be a problem for Brazil. It'll be a problem for the world. So, it will really have to elicit some new form of international cooperation among those who stand for those principles.
So we've got time for a couple more questions. So the first will be from Harriet. And then there's...
Harriet Hannibal, I work with the university on climate and nature. Thank you so much for highlighting the good work that is happening in terms of the COPs and the coordination with the UK. I just wondered if you could talk about the challenges in achieving the NDCs for Brazil, and how might the UK help do more or do something that it's not doing, and indeed how might Cambridge as a university engage with that as well? Thank you.
So the challenges confronting Brazil where the UK can make a difference. I think there are numerous areas. One is, for example, biology, the medical sciences, where UK has developed a very significant expertise, and there are already examples of cooperation to deal with malaria, for example, and other diseases. There's no doubt that the UK, while if you look at the GDP, they're not so different. The population is very different between Brazil and UK. But there's no doubt that the level of scientific development in general here is much higher than in Brazil. So cooperation in areas of advanced science and technology are highly desirable. But there are other instances where Brazil can also be an interesting partner for the UK. I think in the development of renewable sources of energy, for example, for aviation. And I understand that Shell and BP are working closely with Brazilian partners precisely along these lines, as well as renewable fuel for maritime transportation. So this entire agenda, and of course education, I'm here at a university, one of the most prestigious in the world, and I was just meeting with Brazilian students. There's a strong desire on the part of Brazilian youth to benefit from the excellence in the quality of your academic institutions. And there was a request from one Brazilian compatriot that I transmit the UK government a strong interest in more flexible rules for visas and permanence in the UK, because this is affecting the opportunities for many students. So I'm quite encouraged and optimistic. In other areas, I think we need to establish a deeper dialogue and understanding, perhaps for trade to reach higher levels. If you look at the size of the two economies, the scale of international trade is a little disappointing. It really is not all that significant. $6 billion US two-way trade. And even if you look at the major products that are imported, it's almost embarrassing, because the number one product we import is whiskey. And the number one product imported by the UK from Brazil is gold. We can do much better than that. We produce aircraft. We produce, a number of very competitive in a number of agricultural products. The UK is very competitive in a number of industrial and other products.
Thank you. So last question, the gentleman at the... yes.
Hi, I'm Adrian Lerner. I teach Latin American history here. So maybe 1 or 2 years ago, John Kerry was a special envoy for climate. Went to Brazil, met with Marina Silva, and they had this kind of wonderful, friendly meeting after Bolsonaro regime. And suddenly he said something in the lines of, Amazonia is a global resource, it belongs to everybody. And then Marina Silva had this moment where she stares at the camera, like in the office, the show. Says we all know who it belongs to, right? We are a sovereign nation, Amazonia. She repeats sovereignty like 6 times. And that seems obvious, right? But it actually, do you foresee any potential tensions between this idea of Amazonia as a commons, so something that Emmanuel Macron also loves to say, and Brazil's agenda for the Amazon? And there's a long tradition, I think, in Brazil of certain apprehension for the idea of the world and the other powers over Amazonia. And also there are very powerful actors in Brazil, in Brazil's economy and Brazil's politics even, who have different ideas about Amazonia, very different to conservation. So what will be the agenda for Amazonia in Brazil? Because it's also a very poor region that actually does need development. So what's the long-term plan?
Well, this would take us into a very long reply, but let's say to summarize, first of all, zero deforestation by 2030. So, you know, again, the most responsible behavior when it comes to any environmental challenge. But also I would repeat what Marina Silva herself is very articulate at pointing out, is that the region is still under threat from greenhouse gas emissions that do not originate in Brazil. So let's exercise collective responsibility. And of course, respecting sovereignty. I mean, there's desertification in Africa. This doesn't mean that countries will invade Africa to prevent that from happening. It's not going to stop the desertification, is it? So what happens when you see a country exercising sovereignty in a very responsible way? I don't think there's any room for this kind of misunderstanding that, oh, perhaps we should, discard Brazilian sovereignty over the Amazon. Frankly, I don't see that as a fantôme, kind of threat in the horizon. But one thing that I would add, among the Brazilian military, there is a certain degree of paranoia in this respect. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. We have to draw the formal part of the proceedings to a close, but not before doing three things. First of all, I'd like to thank the Brazilian Society very much for the partnership and this event. Secondly, for those of you who haven't yet had your fill of the Center for Geopolitics, there is more on Wednesday, where we have Professor Dirk Oschmann coming to speak on whether German unification has failed. That's at Trinity Hall at 5:30. And if you're still not satisfied, you can come back to Peterhouse on the 27th of November and hear about the role of women in geopolitics at Peterhouse, or women at Peterhouse, their role in geopolitics. And there are many other events besides which you can read about on our website. But finally, of course, I would like to thank on all of our behalf His Excellency, Mr. Patriota, for coming and being with us on this of all days, a great day,
Great day
for Brazil, an important day for the world, so we're most grateful.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.